Among the many virtues and vituperations that course through Ta-Nehisi Coates' Creedeke Between the World and Me, there exists a quieter argument about the importance of enunciation, poetry, dialogue, the act of writing and reading, in interrogating one's own humanity and learning to think like a humanist. Poetry was the processing of my thoughts, Coates writes, until the slag of justification fell away and I was left with the cold, steel truths of life. He continues, I had forgotten my own self-interrogation. I was only beginning to learn to be wary of my own humanity, of my own hurt and anger. I didn't yet realize that the boot on your neck is just as likely to make you delusional as it is to ennoble. The art I was coming to love lived in this void, in the not yet knowable, in the pain, in the question. The older poets introduced me to artists who pulled their energy from this void, the gnawing discomfort, the chaos, the intellectual vertigo was not an alarm, it was a beacon. As a writer who speaks from the void and about it, just as W.E. Du Bois spoke from within the veil and around it, Coates articulates a hermeneutic anxiety and a historical responsibility that lies at the heart of humanistic thought. The void that emerges through the act of writing is not simply an evocative abstraction lost in the midst of metaphor. The void is quite literally the empty space of erasure and extermination, of missing persons, destroyed things, hidden histories, lost records, expropriated lands, and murdered minorities. The humanist must graphically evoke such emptiness and erasure without sublimating these absences, remaining all the while, as Coates puts it, wary of every dream and nation. Voids in writing, Coates argues, signify the defining feature being drafted into the black race, which is the inescapable robbery of time. In revisiting the violation and erasure of everyday existence, the writer as humanist attempts to revitalize the temporality and territoriality of what was once soiled and sundered, but must now be regrounded in another alterity, a spirit of neighborliness. Reading Between the World and Me makes me increasingly aware of the problematic protagonist of the narrative. It is neither the subjectivity of personhood, nor the identity of the citizen, but repeatedly and relentlessly the body, the black body, which of course immediately implicates the white body, and also interpolates in that very moment the interstices between them, the relational anxiety, the alterity that afflicts the identification of the body itself. In a similar vein, it could be said that the writerly persona of Frantz Fanon's diverse works is indeed the psychoaffective body, the body as a writing instrument, an agent of inscription as intervention, caught in the restless agony between violence and security, surveillance and protection. And it is something that has struck me recently, that post a whole generation of thinking around biopolitics, after a range of problematizations of the body, there is a resurgence of the body that needs to be thought again. You hear it in Ta-Nehisi Coates. You hear it in Claudia Rankine's book, The Citizen, where I was in a longer version of this. I've actually referred and worked on that. This notion of the body is returning not simply as a site of the transcription of difference, which is exactly how we'd encountered it for a couple of decades, but the body as making a kind of social shape. The body as both occupying an affective anxiety of belonging. The body not only as the object of surveillance, but the body as creating the demand for a different kind of security. I mention here, and will repeat myself, but post 9/11 there seems to me to have been a huge emphasis on surveillance in the arts. You can't go anywhere in the world today, almost I would say, and not find a project of installation, photography, fiction, which does not have some resonance with surveillance. But I think post-surveillance, post-biopolitics, and I have something, and I'm being a little bit hasty here, because I would like to connect it in some way with the notion of biopolitics, but there is a new discourse, I believe, demanding the security of the body, not only as the security of personhood, but the security of occupying a certain space, being able to move through it, and the body identified with life and death at the same time. The body is floated on the fear of the dying body, not only the body in pain, but the extinction of the body. The body seems to me to be a new way of thinking emphatically about security and the possibilities of habitation. And I think this is a somewhat different move from the earlier work on the body, where we demanded continually that the body be defined, that its gender differences, its racial difference. I think there is a move away from that, and I'm trying to work on it at the moment and would be happy to talk to you about it. The body, as I said, in Fanon, I think is a precursor of this psychoaffective body. Not only the psychoanalytic body, but the psychoaffective body. The phrase comes indeed from The Wretched of the Earth, although it is a concept which in my introduction to The Wretched of the Earth I've tried to develop, but one that he himself does not fully develop, but certainly he sets the marker for trying to think about the body in this affective, ethical space. Riding the void is a practice of intellectual discomfort, beset with gnawing doubts and impending ambivalences. And the writer is an agent, forewarned, as Coates suggests, to be wary of every dream in every nation, even his own nation, perhaps his or her own nation more than any other, precisely because it was their own. Vulnerable cosmopolitanism arises from an all too vigilant awareness of the powerful and necessary blessing and cursing that occurs in the snarled traffic between nations, neighborhoods, and the global condition. The internal emigrant, for whom every flag is a cry of pain, still insistently and intimately identifies with her moorings and bindings before asking what behooves us. Conflicted and ambivalent agency of the nation in mourning and the pained protest of the homesick neighbor are integral to a global ethic, not opposed to its achievement, as precarity theorists frequently contend. Between the world and me, there exist ambivalent, agonistic relations between national namings and neighborhood denominations that radically determine the Levinasian face of global ethics. Conditions of vulnerability, discrimination, poverty, inequality, injustice can lead to acts of violence and self-violation in pursuit of a tabula rasa, as Fanon argues, that represents in equal parts the hopelessness of extinction and marginalization amidst the disfigured hope for opportunity and equality. Now, I have for some time been trying to think of a measure of time, a critical measure of time, of course, a synthetic measure of time, that speaks to these interests of mine. The thing that is smaller than and yet effective. The constellation in Benjamin, for instance, which is always the emphasis both in Benjamin's, and Benjamin has been an inspiration for me. Not that he solved my problems, he always makes them much worse. But it is actually very interesting, you know, his notion of the miniature, his notion of the smallness. It is the smallness, the small broken off thing that allows the work to be translated. It is the small moment in history, the constellated moment that allows for historical transformation. So there isn't a kind of a longer theoretical piece, but in a lecture I gave in CUNY, which one of you came and just talked to me about, I was trying to talk about these smallness, why smallness becomes a measure of, in Benjamin, of the immense complexity of what I've been calling these deeply dense and palimpsestic relations. And for that, I've decided to try and develop a concept of what I call diurnality. Right? It's as synthetic a critical concept as anything else, the diurnal, the thing that happens in the day itself. And of course, more work I do on refugee discourses, which I am doing at the moment, the measure of time is so much, not simply as we see it in the policy discourses, which is, for instance, that 5 or 7 years in a refugee camp, 5 or 7 years in a refugee camp is quite normal nowadays. That to wait for a visa for that time, you know, people live in this kind of limbo. But if you read the testimonies of escape, the testimony of travel, of quest, the day by day by day by day, and I'm trying to understand now this notion of temporality, not just physically the day, but this kind of iterative sameness, that is both banal and entirely uncanny. I'm trying to understand this. So I'm developing, and I decided to come out of the closet with this concept and use it a little bit in this talk, just to see how it runs. So I've been trying to think about this notion of the diurnal measure. So here am I, trying the car out for the first time. Between the world and me lies the visibility of the face defaced in the detail of diurnal life, the blessing and cursing that meet together in the morning. I want to propose that the diurnal, read as the measure of the day composed of the iterative conditions of vulnerability and banality, banality is the commonality of banality, reveal the small worry lines visible on the face in some way defaced, and the anguish of an agency struggling for balance in the comparison of incomparables. Diurnality, as I have proposed elsewhere, relates in some ways to the temporality of the sign-stroke image Benjamin proposes in the Arcades project. The sign or image, and I quote him, that exceeds to legibility in a now of recognizability. I've been very fascinated by this. What does it mean for something to exceed to legibility? The essay on photography also keeps talking about this. You know, there are things in there which only come to be visible at a certain time, and he calls this the now of recognizability. That was for me yet another prod to start thinking of the temporality of the diurnal in Benjamin's work, which you know is about emergent time as the time of emergency, to use a phrase. Diurnality, as I proposed elsewhere, relates to Benjamin. Every present day, he writes, is determined by the images that are synchronic with it. Each now is the now of a particular recognizability. And this interests me because this is not a presentist now, right? This is not a now of plenitudinous. This is not simply a now of the entire context of a particular day or a particular moment. This is a particular now that has within it the traces and the emergences of something coming to be, but not simply becoming. I'm sorry to confuse you with this. I am confused, but I believe that it is an important way of beginning to think about the larger questions of history and emergency. And this notion of the now, the recognizability of the now, we can talk about it. I have become really quite interested in, and my attempt at talking about or developing a theory of time as diurnal time comes from this, as much as it comes from the kind of existential and phenomenological anguish in records and reports of migration, where people are waiting every day to get the letter they know will only probably come 6 months later. But the fact that the letter will only arrive 6 months later does not make the expectation of the everyday any less. The destruction of the ordinary plumbs the depths of evil, and at the same time, the survival of the ordinary provides a measure of moral and social recovery. Here again, my plea to you to think about this, to think about the ordinary or the everyday as the diurnal, as the turning clock of the day, a kind of transformative moment. Indeed, the banality of what is held in common, the schoolhouse, the hospital, the church, goats, sheep, cows, Uruwaga, banana, beer, Primus beer, and machetes, become the most intimate and imminent instruments of evil. Yet after the genocide, it is these intimate objects that become the instruments of a shared community, of a fate that enables Rwandans to rebuild their lives, to say of themselves again and again, we tell stories, we swap explanations, we tease one another. And if you see the footage of the Gacaca trials, it is a very strange and unsettling experience, the way in which humor is used, laughter, accusations of others, trying to tell the story of others. It's a very, for me, it's a very unsettling, but a very provocative kind of way of thinking of a legal system, which is about trying to understand and rebuild rather than a system based on the advocacy of accusation. Perhaps the most salutary instance, I'm coming to the end now, in which brutality becomes a starting point for attempting to conceive, as I've just shown you, of an ethical political community, is to be found in Hannah Arendt's concept of the right to have rights. Arendt traces the origins of this idea to the brutish, teeming lives of the stateless between wars and after Nazi ascendancy. We became aware of the existence of the right to have rights, she writes, only when millions of people emerged who had lost and could not regain those rights because of the new global political situation. It's interesting how often the word global emerges in contexts like Lemkin in 38, transnational, or global for a kind of, in Hannah Arendt for an ethics. And this notion of the right to have rights has made such an immense comeback, partly because it is a non-foundationalist notion. It is a notion of the interhuman. It is that if you do not recognize the rights I have, I don't have them. It is not in its essence in Arendt. Arendt, having conceived of the problem after state institutions of mediation had failed so dramatically, the essence of it for her was, if you do not recognize my right, you see the interhuman, if you do not recognize my right, you see the enunciative, if I do not recognize you as an addressee, you do not recognize me, then you can't have them. And that was for her the lesson of those who had the most sophisticated judicial system and the most complex and productive cultural system, suddenly finding themselves out there without the right to have rights. The relevance of Arendt's argument here lies in her insight into the global as a structure of ambivalence. There is no outside to the global system, Arendt suggests. Whatever alienates global interdependence or annihilates global values must be seen to be an effect of the internal dialectic, a demonic dynamic of the global condition itself. Deadly danger to any global civilization is no longer likely to come from without, Arendt writes. And I think that this in our time is extraordinarily important in even trying to understand those things that we find most appalling, like ISIS or Daesh. You know, these things come out of the dynamics that we know. These things come out of, they do not come out of elsewhere. They come out of that global dynamic. They are versions that we find reprehensible. But in that sense, we cannot not take some responsibility for it. However obnoxious they are, we cannot simply say, and this is also Fanon's idea actually from the other side, one of the least cited moments in Fanon is when he says, in the colonial context, at some level, the soul of your antagonist is also your own, the soul of your enemy. You cannot just, I forget the exact phrase, but you just cannot leave him to go his own way or leave her to go her own way. Deadly danger to any global civilization is no longer likely to come from without. The danger is that a globally universally interrelated civilization may produce barbarians from its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages. And then I asked, what kind of monstrous birthplace is this when barbarism emerges from the sack of civility? In Thinking and Moral Considerations, her beautifully wrought meditation on the banality of evil, late piece by Arendt, I think the best, one of the great pieces by Arendt, she argues that conscience appears as an afterthought. What causes a man or a woman to fear it is the anticipation of the presence of a witness who awaits him or her only if and when he goes home. And of course, the deep metaphor is that you are the person who is waiting for yourself. It is not somebody else waiting to point the finger. You are waiting for yourself. The future-looking nature of global memory, which is neither redemptive nor tragic, is both an afterthought, the projection of traumatized past, and an anticipation, our hope for a restorative future. The moral witness is caused in a double time frame of memory, surviving the testimony of the past while striving to possess the freedoms of an impatient future that will not wait for the fullness of our reflection. The complex temporal layering of memory consists, one might say, of a past that refuses to die, confronted by a future that will not wait to be born. The America I started with is as far from Rwanda as they both are from the Mediterranean. And yet between the intransigent past and the impatient future, there emerges a moment that reminds me of Coates's haunting line that I spoke all those many pages ago. The robbery of time is not measured in lifespans, but in moments. There is also an echo between Coates's belief that black lives are robbed of the very moments that make up a lifetime, and Arendt's censure of European nations that robbed millions of people, their own citizens, of the time of their lives and condemned them to savagery or worse. Such orphaned echoes do not make canonical history or conclusive political arguments, But there is always a purpose, as Walter Benjamin once said, in interspersing the homogeneity of the epoch with the ruins of the present. It is within these ruins that Gaith, a Syrian refugee, ekes out an existence, surviving in a timeless void between life and death. The savagery to which he is condemned robs him of a time he can only measure in the disproportion between certain death and the slim chance of another life. And it is with his words that I want to close. I made it while thousands of others didn't. Some died on the way. Some died in Syria. Every day you hear about people drowning. Just think about how much every Syrian is suffering inside to endure the suffering of this trip. In Greece, someone asked me, why take the chance? I said, in Syria, there's 100% chance that you're going to die. If the chance of making it to Europe is even 1%, then that means there is a 1% chance of your leading an actual life. Thank you very much.